Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Talking Deals with David. I'm David Edgar. I'm a corporate partner with the law firm K&L Gates. And today I am joined by really an awesome group that I think is going to make for a terrific discussion. For those of you who have been following Talking Deals with David, you'll recognize Jeremy. You're back again for a repeat performance. Last time we were talking about idea flow. It's great to have you back to talk about Freespin Capital.
Thanks for having me, David. I'm excited to be back.
Yeah, it's terrific. And we're spanning geographies too. Katie, you're a partner of mine in sort of doing tech transactions based in Chicago. And I think this is your first time joining me for one of these live stream events. So thanks so much for joining me.
Glad to be here.
That's terrific. And I think, Katie, you might sort of have the role of like reining us all in. I have a feeling. I have a feeling about that. You know, given the sort of telling us all the legal issues that we need to think about. And Henrik, I think you're in Copenhagen now, so we're kind of spanning the geographies.
Yeah, live from Copenhagen.
Yeah, it's terrific. Yeah, Jeremy was mentioning. I wondered about that because I knew that. I knew that was sort of your home base, but then had relocated to New York and were working there. Are you sort of back and forth splitting time between Copenhagen and New York or other places?
Yeah, exactly right. I'm one of those who I've been living in New York for the last 12, 14 years or so, and then at the tail end of COVID, my wife and I thought it'd be fun to have the kids try to go to Danish school, and so since we were remote anyway, we kind of like went here, and so now we're trying to find our way back to New York City.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, well, and the weather here, it's been perfect. I don't know what's happening in Copenhagen, but it's been like super warm on the East Coast and very nice weather. So I think we're finally into summer, which is great. But yeah, I noticed you were kind of doing lots of different things back and forth. And Jeremy, you've been busy, I know, still talking about idea flow and doing podcasting. You're mentioning you're back doing a class for the spring term. Tell me again what that class was, because I thought that sounded really interesting, kind of a super cool kind of spin on design. Some of the design.
David, you're supposed to be bringing us to focus here. We're flaring.
You're right.
But the class I'm teaching at Stanford right now is called Transformative Design. I'm teaching it with a mechatronics guru and a theater and dance instructor at Stanford. And the three of us are turning the tools of design process on the most important project of all, which is oneself. And we're working with about 30 graduate students and PhDs and a couple of enterprising undergrads who snuck their way into this life design challenge and bringing the tools of design there. And so it's been an invigorating journey. We're 9 weeks into the 10 weeks. They've got their final assignment is due on Monday, where they're using design to reinvent a relationship. And so we're really eager to hear how their relationships were improved. Hopefully everybody, we've never had anyone injured or harmed in the making of the course. And so we're hoping for another successful year, but we'll see. Monday, fingers crossed.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, but no, look, I am focusing in the sense that that's what you have I think taught us from Idea Flow about combining, different disparate ideas, different areas that you might focus on and finding ways that they relate to each other or can help to sort of fuel innovative thinking and creativity. So that's one of the things I love about it. And a lot of the things, Henrik, that you're working on, Jeremy, that you've been working on in the past have sort of come together. I see a lot of, interaction with Freespin Capital. So maybe, one of you guys could give us a little overview of what Freespin Capital is. I posted a bit about it on a few posts on LinkedIn, just to give people a flavor of sort of what the idea is and how you're sort of approaching venture capital and innovation and building, companies using this Freespin approach. But give us a little overview of how you came to the idea and what you're thinking about with Freespin.
Perhaps the best place to start is actually just to say quickly what it is and then maybe how we got there. There's definitely a backstory, but quickly what Freespin is a mechanism for freeing trapped assets inside of organizations. It turns out that organizations are creating solutions all the time to their own problems that they never call innovation, and they don't think about capitalizing the way they capitalize innovation because they're just solving internal problems. But insofar as an enterprise having experienced a problem is representative potentially of other enterprises experiencing the same problem, our insight is, why don't we take those solutions that are oftentimes trapped inside of an enterprise that's serving some other market need? Let's take that solution out to serve not only the first customer, the founding customer, but the rest of the market as well. So the canonical example, of course, being AWS, where Amazon had actually solved its own in-house problem around accessing the cloud. And they really quickly realized, wow, if we're experiencing this problem, chances are other are as well. And so they created AWS as a way to externalize that internal function. And what we've seen is very few organizations have kind of either the mandate that Jeff Bezos has been given or had been given by the marketplace at the time, or kind of the investor patience to bear with a lot of experimentation outside of the core. And so where many other organizations have developed interesting solutions to internal problems, very few of them have the ability to externalize them the way that Amazon did. And so we created Freespin, or this mechanism really, as a way to help organizations other than Amazon participate in high growth opportunities that are far outside of their core, knowing that they, in a sense, as the first customer, have really validated product market fit, which is kind of the holy grail in startup land. But I would say, we came to that model because of some of our experiences. And I certainly have mine at Stanford. I feel like I'm hogging the floor. Henrik, you want to talk for a second about some of your background? But what I will say is, totally unrelated, basically parallel streams of experimentation. I'm at Stanford co-leading the accelerator called Launchpad for the last half dozen years and working with entrepreneurs. Henrik's working with entrepreneurs in New York at Prehype. And both of us in parallel are taking the methods that are working phenomenally well for entrepreneurs and seeking to infuse them into enterprises. And in parallel, uncoordinated, running into the same kinds of roadblocks in our respective domains. And having collaborations in lots of different ways, we ended up kind of sharing notes and saying, hey, we're experiencing the same challenges. We're seeing success with this kind of person. We're seeing challenges in this kind of environment. And that's what led to the evolution of Freespin. But that's Henrik, what's your recollection of the
I'm not sure I have that much to add. But I guess the only thing is, I think Jeremy and I have the luxury of having been part of the incubation process, both through startups, but also through these corporate incubators. And I think the irony is with corporate innovation is that it's one of the areas that hasn't necessarily seen a lot of innovation itself. And so I think we were very frustrated about the lack of new models that was being tried in order to figure out how do you create something that fuels the growth of the organization. And obviously, we look at the half-life cycle of Fortune 500s, it's getting shorter and shorter. And some of them are good at making new initiatives, like the example with Amazon. But most companies are very locked into the business that they feel they're in and the type of innovation that they feel they're allowed to do. And so as we were starting to explore that, we thought this idea of not necessarily inventing the future, as Jeremy would say, but just looking at some of the stuff you've already invented and make that part of your growth engine was an interesting area to explore.
Yeah, it's really cool. Well, Katie, I think you actually, that story resonates a bit with you in terms of the AWS experience, but you've had sort of a lot of tech transactional work that you've done on kind of both ends, right? From the external side and also internal at companies that are, trying to be innovative, trying to be creative and capitalize on new technologies.
Yeah, David, that's right. And when we were talking about in preparing for today, my initial question was, okay, how do you find these assets, these tracked assets? I typically will see it come up or bubble up, or at least the thought or idea or dream of it come up in sort of an M&A transaction when you realize, wow, this solution could work industry agnostic outside of our company. And then you try to figure out, how do we make that happen? But outside of that context, how do you guys find these opportunities?
Well, I would say right now it's not really a scalable solution, which is why we are not a venture fund, right? Right now we're trying to figure out is exactly that question. What's the best way to find them? And we have extensive networks. We work with a lot of leadership teams and organizations across industries and across geographies. But right now it's mostly anecdotal. It's mostly word of mouth. It's relationships and friendships where somebody says, hey, could we free spin this? We go, yeah, absolutely. But I think partnerships actually may be the next step for us, perhaps partnering with M&A lawyers or partnering with private equity, or there's probably lots of models where we could effectively scale ourselves and increase the surface area of the search radius, so to speak, because right now it's basically a function of relationships. But what I would say is my observation has been, it's very difficult for an organization to be imaginative about something that it's built and what that thing could become. And so an outside perspective, whether it's an M&A attorney, whether it's a private equity investor, whether it's a consultant, the outside perspective oftentimes provides that kind of objectivity that's required to say, hey, this thing is actually really interesting. I'll tell you one example. We've worked with a partner. We've spun out an asset. This is a restaurant company. With a few hundred locations in the US, we spun out a really interesting bookkeeping software into a new fintech company. And we've capitalized that business, and they're off to the races, servicing not only the first customer, but looking to service the rest of the market. It's a phenomenal opportunity. And I mention this because if anybody could be imaginative about what they've built, it's a company that's already done this with us, right? And yet, when we went to the leadership team a few months ago and said, are there any other assets that we could spin out? Because they see the value, they see the growth potential, they see the benefit even to their business of taking this internal thing. They're basically making rent payments to an internal team. Now they're making mortgage payments, and they're getting equity in this thing that, same space, but now they value it very differently, right? And the leadership team said, we've thought about it, we tried to find it, and the answer is no. And we said, okay, no big deal, no pressure. We're doing we've got lots of folks in the pipeline that we're working with. So it wasn't kind of a matter of urgency. Fast forward a couple of months, we're talking to a fast food restaurant chain that's built an interesting kind of back of house dashboard. And as almost just a diligence measure, we reached out to this restaurant and said, what are your needs around a back of house dashboard? And they said, oh, you mean and they named a product that they had developed internally. And I said, wait, what is this product? They said, oh, we developed it in order to be able to track these important metrics. And I just said to one of the leaders, why didn't you mention that when we asked 2 months ago whether you had any other things? And they go, you're right, right? Which is to say, it's like, this is a company that's already done a deal. They're deeply familiar with the model. And yet when the question comes, do you have anything that could be spun out and externalized? It's really difficult because, for a restaurant, they're thinking about the new appetizers or the new desserts or, same store sales or restaurant renovations. And when they think about what they're doing in the market, a lot of times, it's reinventing takeout, it's reinventing curbside or the waiting experience, all of those things. The stuff they've done in the back of house or in their headquarters, they're not even looking there as sources of growth. And so it really does require that outside perspective. And so what we really want to do is develop relationships with kind of scouts or thought partners who can help us see and help organizations see opportunities that they aren't currently seeing.
But you're kind of in all of the areas, like, so some of the work that you're doing, working with companies on becoming more creative, becoming more innovative, all those give you a sort of a perspective on, where companies maybe, especially the larger ones, maybe go a bit sideways, that they're developing things to solve a problem that they have internal. But it's a different thing to then, I imagine, to sort of flip the perspective to say, well, how can I scale that, build that to solve other people's problems? That's a bit of a different, perspective. Do you think that, and maybe that's why the example you gave, Jeremy, they have trouble even identifying what those are, because it's not, they're not thinking of it in the same way that you might be thinking about it when you ask them those questions.
Yeah, and I think a lot of organizations are very good of scaling their existing business, right? In many ways, the organizational structure is set up to make sure that tomorrow look a little bit better than it did today, but not necessarily about how do you build from 0 to 1, which is why corporate incubation and corporate innovation in general is that difficult. And so one of the things that we have helped with is to identify an external leadership team that can take this asset and then run it outside, because the 0 to 1 kind of methodology and exercise is different often than what is known internally. And so what happens is that we take the asset, let's say a piece of software that they've built internally to service themselves, and then we take it, we kind of unwind it from the organization and then build it up in a way where it can stand alone and it can kind of be leased back to the main organization instead.
Okay, so in simple terms, Henry, so what you're doing is, and I love that example that you guys have, sort of more what I would have done in the past was sort of taking companies, and I do a lot of spin in, spin out, spin offs, but they're usually complete disentanglements or complete combinations depending on what you're doing. This sort of bridges both worlds. So what you're doing is taking this kind of trapped software IP, a solution that they might have developed for a problem that their company's having internally, and then what do you do with it? You take and separate the ownership of that, put it into a new entity, and then I guess you could structure it in lots of different ways. But are you seeing that these companies want to take back some equity as sort of consideration for the technology they're pushing into this new entity, and then of course you'll have to lease it back so that they can continue using it, to solve the problem that they originally did. And then what are you doing? Bringing other outside investors in, founder groups or others who then take and actually have to build this out so that it can scale and be used for other companies.
Yeah, exactly right. So the company comes with the software or the IP they built, they infuse it into a new co. We come with a proven entrepreneurial team. So, a new set of founders, if you like, that we install into this organization. The launch organization retain some equity components, and we capitalize it, and then we're off to the races.
So that's great. Yeah, Katie. And one thing that comes to mind is, what are you thinking about that in terms of how you sort of view the world in your practice? Because I'm thinking, boy, that's got to be tough in some cases to disentangle, because you're essentially doing a carve-out transaction. You may have background technology or other technology that sort of went into that, or even third-party technology. So what are you thinking about when you sort of think about the Freespin model from more the legal side?
Yeah, when we were talking about this, the first thing that struck me was half the time the entities might not even know that the software, the solution even exists internally. They haven't even identified it. By the time they identify it, they probably can't tell you a whole lot about how it was developed, who developed it, when, where, what was it cobbled together with, what third-party software might be in there, right? There's a very different model between developing something for external consumption versus internal use. No one really knows, it could have all these bugs and quirks and all that stuff. So this point where you guys spin it off into a new co, sort of the most interesting piece to me, because I imagine there's a lot of unanswered questions. There's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of risks. So you have maybe a sort of a prototype use, it works internally, but the question is, okay, well, who owns it? What's it made out of? Is it house built on straw? How do you guys deal with that inflection point? All of those unknowns that inevitably are going to flow through.
Yeah, so we're obviously early on, so I'm sure there's going to be a lot of edge cases that kind of appear as we do more of these. But the nice thing with software is that increasingly the code itself is obviously of value, but the business principles and the logics that was kind of codified in the code is often what is much more interesting. And as anybody who works with technology knows, that everything is always spaghetti code that has to get rebuilt all the time, right? And so I think in the many ways, we are taking the same kind of principle stand that, yes, there will be IP, yes, there will be data, there will be components that we will have to transfer, and where from a legal point of view, you'll have to kind of sign over the rights for. But in many ways, when it is something that has to certainly serve a lot of different people, have more APIs because it has to serve other types of systems, then you often have to rebuild quite a large component of it, which I guess historically was a big issue, but now obviously software is getting increasingly easier to write. And so what is difficult for somebody who's building companies from scratch to find is a is a company that already have, let's say, $1 million of run rate revenue with an existing launch customer that is so happy with the product that they're willing to commit, let's say, for another 10 years. And so if you can solve that business problem, which is basically having the product market fit from day one, and then figuring out a way to make sure that the technical components underneath the hood is fixed is doable.
It's what's maybe perhaps another way of saying what Henrik said, Katie, is for us, the important thing, the IP is almost just like it's a placeholder for what is of value to the organization that is also of value to a startup. So the IP is just you kind of blow your eyes, because the reality is, as Henrik mentioned, a lot of it's got to get rebuilt. And by the way, hyper growth, gifted founders can build really world-class software using world-class tools. So even just the rebuilding exercise is fascinating, because a lot of times it becomes way better kind of overnight. So the software is better. So we're not so concerned about the code base so much as we're concerned about are we clear on what the parameters are of what the enterprise is now going to become a customer of? Because for us, the key de-risking element is that this startup from day one has a lighthouse customer, right? So what exactly are you a customer of, right? And that is, so for us, we almost play the role of synthetic founders. Even before we bring in a founding team, we're working with the enterprise to say, what exactly are you going to be the customer of? Because you can think about, David kind of sketched out these three parties. You've got the enterprise, you've got investors, and then you've got founders. And what Freespin does is we kind of bring those three pieces together. We're the gravitational force, if you will, right? That, the planets are circling at an incredible speed, but they stay together. It's this thing called gravity. Well, we've got an enterprise with a startup with traditional kind of venture capitalists working together, because we've created a construct that resolves the prisoner's dilemma. And whereas historically every actor in that equation makes a suboptimal decision on behalf of the others, if we are able to put the construct together, we're able to make the decision that's actually better for all of the parties involved. And really it comes down to, is the enterprise willing to be a new customer of this new co? If so, then the founders of the new co have an incredible advantage, because now they have an environment to prototype and develop, et cetera, in. And the investors have an incredible advantage, because they're getting, call it, post-product market fit products or companies at pre-product market fit prices, right? And so we're pulling those components together. But the key is not really the IP. The key is actually, this is going from kind of an internal customer relationship to an external customer relationship.
And one caveat I would put in there, though, is that as we see our business, these type of deals develop over the next few years, more and more will obviously be AI enabled. And so I would imagine that a large component of it will have some kind of data element to it that the organization have access to that is difficult to get access to outside. And they obviously, from a legal point of view, will have to be pretty clear on what kind of data is within scope and which one is out.
Yeah, that's becoming more important, especially with tougher data privacy and other restrictions that you see around the world. But it's really interesting, Henrik. Your development, I think, has just been really cool. Like you mentioned maybe before we jumped on, that you sort of had done some, I guess I would say almost product development work at MTV, and then moved on, and obviously co-founder at Bark, which is a super cool company in its own right. But how has that sort of evolved your thinking around this? I mean, and another company that you're involved with is Pre-Hype, where you do really, I guess, taking great, smart, intelligent people out of companies for a bit, working with them to incubate innovation and ideas, and then push them back. But these are all they're all gravitating, to use your visual, around a similar idea. Is that something that you've always been interested in? And then your path kind of takes you in these different directions, kind of leading to this Freespin approach?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated about trying to use technology to rabbit around problems to make kind of like scalable solutions. And I think in many ways, that obsession have led me both to be a practitioner of that. And so I've actually built companies. But what led me to Jeremy was I've always been intellectual, interesting in like the method of how you do it. And interesting enough, there aren't a lot of schools, like of how you actually build. You can obviously take an entrepreneur class and stuff like that. But I've always been very fascinating. How do you atomize the process? It started, and I'll mention this story because it'll make a bunch of lawyers spin their head. But I started up in MTV Europe as a producer, and early in my career, I knew a lot about. Early on, I knew a lot about computers, and so before the internet, there was something called FidoNet, and I was big on that and built an ISP here in Denmark. And so my bosses at MTV figured out I knew about computers, and so back in like late 90s, they came to me and said, "Can't you come up with a TV show about the internet?" And I came up with what I thought was a great idea and pitched it to my boss, and he thought it was a horrible idea. At which point, I was 22, I thought it was a great idea to break into the studio of MTV at 2 a.m. and make this show, which I did. And so at the time, you didn't get sued. You got a job, probably fueled by the fact that I think 20,000 people called the next day and asked when the show would be back on air.
So we can watch the show now. We need a name and a YouTube link immediately.
I mean, like I'll try to be a more professional, like a mature man now. So I would recommend the Harvard Business Review case study where it's documented. Maybe that's better.
Right.
But what happened there was I got asked then to basically run product development for MTV International, and we were going through a journey there where we would not only want to do TV shows, but we also want to do computer games development and stuff like that. And because they outside the US had 110 channels in 164 countries, part of my job became how do you create almost like a machine that spits out new products. And so I became obsessed with trying to come up with systems of how you do that. And later in my career, it became how do you create systems that creates new products or new ventures, and that's kind of where which have led me to this new form of that system.
Well, and actually Shelby mentioned what I was going to say, which is it shows again, I guess in some cases, the benefit of just plowing ahead. And if you get into trouble, you can always ask for forgiveness later, as opposed to, going and saying, "Hey, I'd like to do this and let me set this up." Isn't that one of the biggest problems actually when you get into these larger companies? And it doesn't matter, how innovative, how nimble they were. We see that with all the big tech companies now. And I see that in my practice a lot where, you do a lot of spin in kind of work where you acquire very dynamic, very creative, interesting companies that, are at various stages of development. And then in a lot of cases, it just dies. And they simply, it becomes impossible to keep that kind of vision and dynamic approach going when you're, in a big company with a lot of different things. Is that kind of also what you're battling probably at MTV, but also at some of these other companies that you consult with?
Yes and no. I feel a lot of time, the business that I started, we make products for dogs, right? And there's obviously different rigor that you need around, for example, making a toy and making an airline, right? I don't want anybody who's making banking system or medical devices or planes kind of like flying on the seat of their pants and kind of just winging it, right? And so I definitely have a lot of respect for people who says inside big organization and they have rules they have to follow because they have to follow them. And Bark now being a public company, I obviously realized that they're now kind of rules and you can't just do what you want. Now, that being said, I find a lot of people are creating limits for themselves that actually don't exist, or where the risk is relatively low. And I think actually at MTV, they had a counsel called Yvette Albertine, and I think what she really learned me is what a good lawyer can be, which is that they can be somebody with a really good sense of business, where they go, this is a risk and somebody could sue us for that specific thing, but it seems very unlikely and the potential downside is pretty capped. And so if this is a massive opportunity to do it in the way that you propose, then it might be worth trying that specific one. And so what I think is happening instead is that people don't even ask the legal team, or they don't even ask their boss if they're allowed to do it. They kind of just assume that they can't do it because that is not how things are done. And so I feel the self-censorship of ideation is awfully worse than what I find to be the actual rules or what counsel normally recommends.
Well, it's an interesting, I mean, just in defense of lawyers for a moment, my dad's a lawyer as well, as I think we talked about last time on the show, David, but in defense of lawyers for a second, I'll never forget last year we were doing a large innovation capability building session with a pharmaceutical company on the East Coast. And we had brought them, the purpose was mostly learning, but they also wanted to develop new products that they might consider launching in the future in a couple of kind of strategic areas. We got the teams to ideate mostly freely without censorship. We got them even to prototype and things like that. But then when it came to the market and actually early stage kind of piloting, beta testing, I started seeing a flurry of emails about how legal won't let us and compliance won't let us and all this stuff. And our kind of the sponsor of the project initiated what would be months worth of kind of wrangling with the lawyers. And we pulled them aside and said, actually, respectfully, this isn't about legal. These people are afraid to move forward in a particular way. This is radically different from the safety of the typical kind of day-to-day. And this is a leadership training program. So it's a learning opportunity, right? And what does it mean to be a leader? It means to work differently than maybe the conventional. So we treated it as a learning opportunity. But to me, it was a really eye-opening moment to realize folks who are being asked to do unconventional things or unfamiliar things will typically look for a scapegoat, right? And legal is a great scapegoat. And to Henrik's point, when we dig into it, they never even had asked legal. It's just, it's almost like nobody ever got fired for hiring McKinsey. Nobody ever got fired for blaming the lawyers, right? It's just like, you just say, yeah, we can't, legal said we can't do it. And everybody goes, oh, well, legal, right? Well, you dig in and you go, actually, legal never touched this. It turns out you, person in HR or finance or sales, you are personally fearful of operating in a different way. But rather than saying, guys, I feel afraid, you say, legal won't let me do it, right? And so recognizing that some of those self-imposed boundaries, and that actually gets to a kind of another why, so to speak, of the Freespin mechanism. It is because the kinds of folks who end up gravitating towards secure and stable jobs, which, by the way, is a very sane and rational thing to do, are not the kind of people that orient towards 0 to 1, kind of insane, unstable work, right? And the challenge for organizations is they go, I want to take these very sane, reasonable, stable people and put them in this highly ambiguous, volatile environment. Let's just see how that goes, right? And we go, Henrik and I have seen this movie enough times to know it doesn't go well, right? And so organizations typically lack the kind of the profile of individual who's going to take a nascent venture and build it into a massive new business, especially if it's unrelated to the core, right? And so they lack oftentimes human capital, and then they lack financial capital. Henrik, I remember one time in one of our early stages of negotiations with one partner, kind of made the offhanded remark, I've never seen a rational CFO cut a $10 million check into a new venture, right? It's a 10% chance of, no rational CFO says, sure, how much did you say? Oh, great, let me write it. They go, what are you talking about, right? But that's effectively what venture investors are doing all the time. And so because of kind of human capital and financial capital restraints, a lot of stuff that could grow, if only it were given kind of the right soil and the right potting, stays small, not because it should or because it has to, but by virtue of the constraints of the environment. And that's really the problem Freespin is seeking to solve.
Yeah, Katie, well, how do you see, like in your practice, I always think you have to have that sort of very close connection to the business teams, the product vision, what you want to achieve. Because if you're too narrow in your perspective, it doesn't make for a good partnership, and it doesn't allow the business to really thrive in the direction it wants to go. Does some of that resonate, the description, I guess, from Jeremy's defense of lawyers and the characterization a bit?
Well, I appreciate the defense of lawyers. We sometimes deserve it, sometimes not. So, it's hard as an outside counsel to really get in there, right? To have that sort of trust in those conversations and be in the whiteboarding sessions. I will say that a lot of that resonates, Jeremy, with what you were saying when I was in-house at AWS, working directly with the engineering teams and sort of blue sky thinking with them. You're in on the ground floor, you have these conversations. Legal is not the big, scary, no person in the corner that sort of gets brought in at the 11th hour. I think there's a place for a good legal counsel, but it's often on the ground floor, and it's often hopefully not as the scapegoat. But
Right.
Certainly, I think, and it is scary too, what you were saying about you have these sane, rational individuals who, are plodding forward and they are doing what they're doing. Those are sometimes not the people who are going to bring you the big industry busting idea. And sometimes, it's scary and crazy, but sometimes you just go with it. And to your point, Henrik, the penning in the risks or figuring out what they are and then figuring out how to move forward is, what hopefully what good legal counsel is going to do for you guys and your clients as you swim them out with Freespin. Every single venture is going to have some sort of legal risk, right? Can we do this? AI, who knows, right? There's a tremendous amount of unknowns for that. Where did the data come from? You might know, you might not know what's getting fed into it, what's getting out, who owns what, right? Like it's a bit murky at best right now. And I think that, you guys are helping these companies and bring these solutions to market. And it's really great to hear.
It seems very similar to the corporate, to sort of educational spin out, that you see. Have you kind of looked into that model? Stanford does that. I know here in Pittsburgh, we have Carnegie Mellon University that does a lot of that, where you're taking sort of, their mission is not to develop, companies per se, but they develop a lot of ideas and a lot of interesting technology. And then, by using sort of incubator models and other things, they're able to kind of partner in a more profit-oriented way and team up with entrepreneurs or others, sometimes from the university, sometimes out. Is that something that you've thought about, looked at in terms of how you're modeling the Freespin approach?
We've looked at it, and it's interesting. We've been pretty focused on opportunities where the company that have developed it is a user of it themselves. And so that's how we de-risked the deals we looked at. Otherwise, it just becomes an incubation with some IP kind of like, and that is often interesting itself if there's good technology. But for this specific exploration, we've been keen on having the lease back kind of element of it because it just de-risks the whole thing so much.
And so if there's a case where a technology actually services the university, then by all means, we're actually working with let's say an unnamed university medical system. There is technology that some of their physicians have developed that they're currently using. That's a great case of a technology that's developed in the university that is likely not to get scaled to other hospital systems just because incentives aren't there, right? And that's a really great fit for Freespin. But importantly, to Henrik's point, because it's been de-risked by the fact that the university medical system will become a customer of that thing once it exists on the outside. The challenge with a lot of the stuff, like you said at Pittsburgh, it's same at Stanford at the Office of Technology Licensing, the OTL is what it's called. There's a lot of technology that's blue sky and huge potential, but like Henrik said, it's kind of undifferentiated to us from all other R&D projects and organizations, namely that they haven't been market de-risked yet. And by requiring, as our model does, that the founding enterprise become the first customer, the lighthouse customer, what we're doing is we are embedding a market de-risking feature in the venture dynamic from the beginning. So unless it fits our criteria that the originating organization becomes the first customer, then it doesn't matter how mind-blowing the technology might be. For us, it's not a free spinnable thing because the key attribute of our model is that the originator becomes the first customer. And in many cases, this blue sky stuff, they go, well, that's not for us. We go, great, then it's not for us, right? I mean, Katie, it sounds like you were inside at AWS, right? I've got the great book about Bezos. It's called The Everything Store, or about Amazon rather. And one of the things that I love, and this speaks to the challenges of this model in general, but one of the things I love is apparently when Bezos and Andy Jassy pitched to the board that they should create AWS as a new product. Even John Doerr, famous Silicon Valley VC who's sitting on the board at the time, says, hey, we're dealing with international expansion. We're dealing with hiring challenges with, Google. Why should we launch this unrelated product? And Bezos' response was, because we need it. Right. And that to us, because we need it is kind of the key differentiator for what makes something free spinnable. And that's what makes it an enduring, defensible position for a new venture to kind of build upon.
And even if it isn't something as far away as cloud software when you're a bookseller, I do think that a lot of companies, they just think about, if you use the metaphor of trees, they just think about how can we make ourselves to become a bigger tree. But what trees have taught us as a species is that the way that you dominate is to become a forest, right? And if you take a case like Apple, which obviously were not a customer of it themselves, but it was a pretty radical move to be a desktop computer manufacturer and then make an MP3 player. But obviously, as they were, looking at how can we kind of plant acorns around kind of like our main business. And so they might even become bigger trees. And I think that way of thinking of innovation is not something that I hear that often, and something that Jeremy and I kind of get geeky about.
We talk nerdy a lot. This is just the tip of the nerdy iceberg.
Well, wait a second. So I'm hearing very clearly then that you need that in order for something to be sort of free spinnable. You've got to have that first customer that needs whatever it is they've developed internally, and so that gives you kind of an immediate market validation. You've got a first customer, you then can build from that. What do you then have to find then? You're not actually running these companies, so are you looking for sort of entrepreneurial teams that want to then and are they from the same company, or are these people that would run these sort of spin out entities, are they just entrepreneurs in that space, and then you work with them to partner with the company that puts the technologies and does sort of the lease back? How are you finding that working, and how are you finding the talent, the people to run these businesses?
I mean, it's a super good question. So Prehype started about 12 years ago when I sold the company to, I helped build to Facebook and didn't really know where to hang. And the interesting thing when you are a second-time founder is that there's not a lot of places that kind of like is a natural fit for you, because you get offered corporate kind of gigs, but you're not kind of ready for that. You get offered maybe to be an EIR at an index, at a venture fund, but you might not be ready for that, and you don't want to sit by yourself at the coffee shop. And so when I created Prehype, it was basically to solve a problem for myself, which was to make like a halfway house for entrepreneurs. And so Prehype has been that for the last 12 years. And a lot of the products that we build on top, the incubation business and the education business, our own businesses, is basically an output of, you take a bunch of entrepreneurs and put them in a room, and then you close the door, and then like companies will come out of that. And so we have built a pretty extensive network of entrepreneurs in residence that we've had through the Prehype network, and that we've kind of curated and built over the last 12 years. And a lot of entrepreneurs come to us when they're in what we refer to as their in-between time. When they've exited something, they might have made some money, but probably not enough to retire. And so they're kind of like thinking about what should their next journey be. And what's fascinating with entrepreneurs is that as a lawyer, when you get a new job, you often get a new job as a lawyer at another firm. But as an entrepreneur, you often don't want to do what you just did, for either legal reasons or for scarring. You kind of want to do something different.
Right.
And so what we find is that we have these entrepreneurs in residence that are looking for the next thing. And some of them are very passionate about a specific topic, and they just want to go and build that, and we help them do that. But some of them are kind of like, hey, this is interesting. You say you have this technology, you have a customer that already want to be a client for the next 10 years. You're going to give me a good chunk of equity. It's already financed. Like, basically, as a founder, you have a lot of the problem solved that you need in order to find your next 10-year project. And so what we come with through Freespin is a entrepreneurial kind of founding team. We tend to focus on people who are not from the company that have developed the technology, for the reason we mentioned earlier, that it's a very specific skill set building from 0 to 1. Sometimes there are technology components, or there's very specific domain expertise that is required to transfer, and that is done with a person or two. But maybe a little bit contrarian, we have so far picked new teams to run these new external units.
And I would say, by the way, the internal teams, you might think, oh, is the internal team bummed? What we've seen is just the opposite. They're actually relieved, because a lot of times they go, I've seen the potential of this thing, but who's going to make it bigger? I got a job, right? And I got kids. I can't take it myself, right? I can't do it. And so we've seen this incredible sense of, in the deals we've done, where the team actually inside of the enterprise, even though they are now the technology is outside of the enterprise, they're tossing ideas over. Have you guys tried this? We've thought about this. Should you do that? Right? Because it's like their baby, right? They really care about it. But it's rare that you actually need the people from inside. Most of the time, again, it's that enterprise signal that there's a commitment to continue to use the thing. And the other thing I wanted to mention, by the way, is I wouldn't think about David, when you asked the question about where do you source founders, Henrik mentioned the pre-hype network. And I don't want that to be, visualized as a pool. It's more like a stream, right? The thing about entrepreneurial, the in-between phase, is it's a passing phase. And so people are moving through. It's not like anybody who's, by the way, been sitting in the pool too long, you probably don't want them running a business, right? It's the people who are passing through. It's a matter of, it's really a synchronization problem that we're seeking to solve, right? Where you're synchronizing founder with enterprise customer with capital partners, and you're bringing those things together. And it's a problem we're constantly trying to solve, is how do we line up the right founding team at this point in time with the right source of capital? It's an ongoing challenge for us, but it's a moving target. And as new opportunities come into our kind of, call it, opportunity pipeline, it's not that we're evaluating the same set of founders. We're going, well, now who's around and who's available and who has relevant skill set and background and interest. And it's kind of an ever evolving, rotating cast of characters in that equation.
Yeah, it's a great way to think about it, because you're not just taking people that are sort of trapped inside. They're flowing through sort of their entrepreneurial journey and then finding them at different spots. But one of the things about sourcing I was thinking about is what I do every day in M&A. There's a lot of value, I think, in what you do, which is what excited me about it, Jeremy and Henrik, when I first learned about this, when we were talking about idea flow. Because to me, you're trying to extract value from deals, and M&A is notoriously bad at doing that. And I had a great professor from Wharton, Emily Feldman, who talked about the real challenges about M&A, but the benefits of doing divestitures or spins. This is very similar. Usually in that context, it's more all or nothing, than what you're doing with the Freespin concept. But one thing I'm thinking about is this is a great sort of value add that companies that are acquirers can, when you have a chance to actually diligence a target, I think there's a real opportunity to start maybe as part of that work stream to identify where might there be technology that was developed for one of these internal purposes that we might be able to free spin as part of the deal or something down the road. But it's a very nice way, I think, of adding some sort of extra synergistic concept to deals that people don't think about otherwise. And it's a good time to do it because you're already kind of involved in, the diligence and the M&A, and you're diving into the tech and all of that at that point. So
that's one, just building on your idea. One thing we've heard, I was talking with a private equity investor the other day who was saying that as part of her strategy, she's got one of the things that you always look for is what can we white label, right? But there are pretty clear parameters for what fits a PE, a standard kind of PE white labeling playbook. And she said, there's a lot of stuff that it could be a product, but we go, that's not what we're going to white label. And so in a sense, another kind of partnership opportunity is finding alternative pathways to white labeling in a private equity context where, again, you're looking for short-term returns, but it doesn't fit the profile or the playbook or the capability maybe even of the investor.
Yeah, it's true. Well, Ian Smith actually had some great comments that you can see on the side. But Ian also does a lot of work on M&A, and he mentions, could accessing these hidden gems, these sort of locked trapped assets, could that be regarded as a form of divestiture? And at least for me, I do think it could be a really interesting way of valuing businesses. And identifying some hidden value at a time when it's very needed. And so for acquirers, maybe whether they're corporate acquirers or even PE, this idea of thinking about, are there free spinnable type software, other IP that we might be able to use in a target company, might be a great way to supplement, what you're doing in terms of other deal sourcing approaches that you're taking.
100%. And I think often the alternative is that it just gets thrown out. I mean, like I've been called many times by internal entrepreneurs who've been working on a project, and either through an M&A deal or whatever it is that is changing the corporate structure, they're calling and say, hey, this project like that is generating tens of millions of dollars of revenue, or which are saving us for tens of millions of dollars of revenue. It's just being closed down because, obviously that amount of money could be a rounding error if you have a large company. And it seemed to be kind of a real pity in the name of innovation that some of these things just get thrown out because there isn't kind of a natural place for them to sit.
Or what you see, I mean, one thing that's fascinating, I was talking to a leader in a consulting organization just last week, and he was telling me there's a couple of products internally, which we're now kind of exploring, but if you take it as kind of an archetypical case, he said there's incredible technology that the internal leader is so frustrated by the need to attend steering committee meetings and basically not be an entrepreneur, they've left. And without them, we're going to sunset this technology, not because it's not doing its job, but because we have not created the environment where a person who needs to lead this can thrive, right? And so you might see this is kind of an alternative pathway to sunsetting a promising technology, right? Or even giving that person the ability to have control and ownership, but then access the broader market. Because a lot of times there's just not the incentives in place to act and behave and build in a certain way when you're inside of the organization where maybe the idea was even generated.
Mm. Well, Katie, what do you see when, oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, what I see a lot that's similar to this in terms of sunsetting the potential trapped asset in an acquisition deal, for example, is often the case is that the acquiring company says, we've got our big ticket software, we're already structured this way. That's great that you've got this solution to solve XYZ problem, but we don't need it. It's too much trouble for us to try to ingest it, find out the bugs, and then make it work just for you guys. We need you to sort of get on board with the larger solution. And I think there's sort of that another opportunity moment for you. But when you were talking, one thing that struck me was, are you looking at certain industries in terms of where these opportunities may sit, or in terms of where to market these opportunities or the solutions when you find them?
Not really. I think the only parameter that we have kind of put on ourselves is that the industry have to be one with kind of where the companies within that industry is N bigger than 20. Like you can't be that it's something that you're one of the 4 big banks and you made the software for yourself and the other customers are the 4 other banks.
Yeah, sure.
And so restaurants, for example, is a good example of where you have quite a big customer pool you can go out to. And so, but outside that, we're very agnostic in what we're looking at. We obviously prefer SaaS, like software rather than hardware or processes or those kind of things for the scale dynamics of software. So that's what we've been focusing. But in an industry perspective, we've been pretty open.
Katie, one thing I was going to ask you is, what do you think from the corporate perspective? So let's say that, Jeremy and Henrik and their team kind of identify, a technology software that is free spinnable and that seems to be a good fit. And what from the legal side do you think of from the company? I could imagine that unless they're really, thinking about this in the right way, the issues we talked about data, separating ownership, figuring out how this was developed, all those kind of issues, or even just becoming entangled with kind of this spin-off company. How would you kind of approach that now that we've sort of gotten into a little more detail so that they're viewing it in the right way and in a way that's sort of more open to new ideas, new approaches. This is something certainly they probably have not seen before in terms of what to do. They're used to selling things completely or, doing other things, spinning things off completely. But this is sort of a hybrid model.
In terms of when they're looking at the potential software acquisition.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that this is just another form of standard due diligence. It's just not what the party that you're looking at is used to or thinks you're going to be asking questions about, right? But it's as if they were a software company that was potentially marketing this to the universe, that you're kick the tires on that. But it's just a lot more of the comfortability in the unknown, right? Or the uncomfortable or the unknowable. I think that some of the bigger risks, obviously, with this type of thing is, who built this? Was it an in-house person or is it a third-party contractor? You're probably going to rebuild most of the code anyway, to Heinrich's point. And I think Ian Smith had a note on that as well, that's just more the norm because it's quick and easy. But at the same time, you want to know if there's any skeletons in the closet. Maybe you're using a Black Duck audit or some sort of third-party auditing software to make sure what's not known there. Third-party dependencies in terms of software. How expensive is this going to be? Do we have to build more than we think because it's dependent on sort of a third-party larger infrastructure that maybe we don't want to pass on that dependency to our future customers? I think there's a lot of the standard questions would be asked, but the answers, if they are just sort of, we don't know, maybe that's okay in this context, right? Maybe that's just sort of like, okay, great. Well, we asked the question, and while we have the people who touched this and saw this and used it every day, and we know that they're not going to be involved going forward. So ask all the questions you need to ask now, because the transition period is probably going to be short and swift, and then the software will look entirely different.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Jeremy, do you have to work with these companies after? Are you doing things like transitional services type agreements? Are you actually contracting back with some of these companies to use their people as you're building out the software or the technology? Or do you take it, do the lease back, and then sort of you handle whatever you're doing with the software going forward and building that out?
No, our kind of standard motto that we find ourselves invoking, countless times a day is relationship, not transaction. We're not, at the end of the day, it's not, there's not an end point here, right? This enterprise is about to become a customer for the next 10 years of this new company, right? So if it doesn't work for them, it doesn't work. That's the thing that's amazing is some people, because we're talking about it almost in terms of espionage or finding or diligence. We use all these words that can kind of make people feel like, wait, is this secretive? Is this wrong? And the answer is, the only way these deals work is if it's a better deal for the enterprise. So there's no secret in the sense that, somebody goes, I don't know if I should tell you about this. It's like, we're not going to build a competitive product. The only way it works is if the enterprise becomes the customer, right? So for us, that attitude or that mantra of relationship, not transaction is critical, because we still have phone calls regularly. Our teams are still interfacing regularly. We're still building, we're still testing, we're deploying, and they've got equity in the thing, right? I mean, they're incentivized to make sure that that this new venture is set up for success. And so that's, again, going back to resolving the prisoner's dilemma. We really feel it's a way to create a win-win where we really are creating a differentiated return profile, because everybody's incentives are aligned to be in the best interest of creating value through this new venture.
I imagine, Jeremy, you also probably get a wish list. Like, hey, I've always wanted to build this, but we never had the resources or the time. Like, can you add all these features?
Right, and the question is, well, what are you willing to pay for that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But by the way, it's an incredibly clarifying thing, because half the time they go, "Oh, you're right, I wouldn't pay anything for that." But then half the time they go, "Well, you could double the service fee if you did that." We go, "Wait, really?" Yeah.
They're your best knowledge base.
We'll on that, right? But again, the customer dynamic is a really clarifying dynamic, because it's not, give us the list, happy to do it, but what's actually going to drive the commercial contract value here? Again, not because we're trying to be extractive or like mercenary. We're trying to understand what are the dynamics that are going to build a robust new venture go to market to the rest of the market. And certainly capitalizing on the opportunities that exist within the founding customer dynamic makes sense, but only insofar as it really works for the customer, and then two, can scale to the rest of the market. So everybody's aligned on those things. And but as Henrik said earlier, it's early days, and there's lots of corners that we haven't explored and edge cases, and we're gonna fall off 1,000 cliffs that we haven't even seen yet. But it's working with, I mean, I'm tremendously grateful for the opportunity to get to talk with the two of you, and Ian for your comments, among others in the chat. It's humbling, and it's a privilege to get to talk to you, because you're helping inform and shape and iterate the model just through your conversation today.
Yeah, it's really awesome, Jeremy. I loved it when I first heard about it. I forget where I maybe seeing something on the blog or someplace that you're writing about, but Henrik, your background is just incredible. We need to talk about other things on another time, but I love your approach to thinking about these issues. And of course, Jeremy, it's like a perfect meld, I think, to all the work that you've been doing and the terrific things that you talk about, creativity and innovation, and really blending it together. I think it sort of works. It seems like it will work very, very well together with the other things that you're doing. And I think it was a fantastic conversation. So Henrik, thanks so much for joining us all the way from Copenhagen. We appreciate that a lot.
Thank you.
I'll make a plug for Henrik since he won't, but he wrote a book called The Acorn Method, which came out a few years ago, which he kind of made a reference to, but it's a fantastic read. At the very least, folks should read it. But I think, David, it would be a great subject of another podcast at some point. For sure.
Yeah, I'm going to get it. I saw it, Henrik, when I was kind of doing a little background. So I'm going to grab that. It looks fantastic, and I love kind of your approach to to these sort of interesting problems, and it's really interesting. Katie, thanks so much for adding the tech lawyer perspective on things, and for joining me. I know you're busy, and so I really appreciate you taking the time to sit with Jeremy and Henrik and me.
My pleasure. Great conversation, guys. Great to meet you all.
Yeah, it's terrific. Okay, well, thanks so much, Jeremy, Henrik, Katie. Thank you very much, and we appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, see ya.